My name is Layla Morgan Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions are made quietly, but power is anything but. On paper, I'm a Senior Data Compliance Analyst, which sounds technical, safe, replaceable. I'm the one who reviews access logs, audits internal systems, and ensures regulatory standards are met. I don't lead meetings, I don't dominate conference calls, I rarely interrupt anyone. And because of that, people tend to decide who I am before I ever speak. They see calm and assume a passive role. They see soft-spoken and assume unsure. They see a woman who prefers documentation over debate and mistake that for fragility. What they don't see is that I notice everything. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or shouting across polished boardroom tables. It's about something quieter, something colder, something far more irreversible. Not long ago, I was accused of leaking confidential company data, information that could have cost millions in contracts and reputation. The accusation didn't come with screaming. It came with polite emails, closed-door meetings, a subtle shift in how people avoided my eyes in the hallway. I remember the exact moment the narrative started forming around me. The careful language, the rehearsed concern, the quiet distancing. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Then I realized it was positioning. Over the next several weeks, I watched how quickly credibility can be rewritten when it's convenient, how easily silence can be interpreted as guilt, how power protects itself. But here's the part no one expected. I work in data compliance, and data leaves fingerprints. When I finally pulled the internal logs and traced the breach to its origin, the source didn't lead to my desk. It didn't even lead to my department. The source traced back to the executive floor. What happened after that wasn't explosive. It was precise. This is the story of what it feels like to be underestimated in a room that depends on you, of choosing strategy over noise, of revealing the truth without raising your voice, and of learning that sometimes the most powerful move is simply showing the evidence. Have you ever felt the ground shift beneath you while everyone else pretended it was steady? To them, I was solid. That was the word I heard most often in performance reviews. Solid, reliable, thorough, never visionary, never strategic, never indispensable. I was the person they CC'd when something needed checking. The quiet insurance policy. The human firewall who made sure regulatory disasters didn't happen. My reports were clean. My audits were airtight. My documentation could withstand external investigation. But none of that made me visible. In meetings, I sat halfway down the table, not at the head, not at the edge. A physical representation of how I existed in the company, present but peripheral. When executives debated expansion strategies, I took notes. When product teams rushed features to market, I flagged compliance risks in carefully worded emails. When someone asked, "Is this safe to deploy?" all eyes would briefly shift to me. I would answer, calmly, precisely. Then the attention would move on. I wasn't ignored because I lacked competence. I was ignored because I wasn't loud. And in our industry, loud often passes for leadership. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being dependable. You become infrastructure. And no one congratulates infrastructure until it fails. I understood that early. I grew up in a household where emotions were expensive. My mother believed in preparation, not performance. Be so prepared they can't argue with you, she used to say. I took that literally, so I built myself into someone who couldn't be easily dismantled. I learned systems inside and out. I studied not just compliance rules, but the architecture beneath them. I knew how access permissions flowed, how logs were stored, how edits were tracked, how timestamps could tell stories if you knew how to read them. But to most people at Whitmore Technologies, I was simply Layla from compliance. The woman with the silver USB drive necklace, the one who never seemed flustered. Some coworkers liked me in a distant way. They'd say, "Layla's chill," as if calmness were a personality trait rather than a discipline. Others leaned on me heavily, knowing I would fix their oversights without public correction. No one saw me as a threat, and that was the point. There's something disarming about a woman who doesn't compete for the spotlight. It makes people careless around you. They assume your silence equals agreement. They mistake your observation for detachment. I learned to let that misconception live. When executives spoke too freely in meetings, I listened. When someone forwarded sensitive drafts without encryption, I noticed. When department heads bent internal policy to accelerate timelines, I documented. Not to weaponize, just to understand. If you work in compliance long enough, you begin to see patterns, not just in data, but in people. Who deflects responsibility? Who shifts blame subtly? Who positions themselves early when something feels unstable? By the time the accusation landed on me, I already knew how narratives were constructed inside that building, because I had watched them being built around others before. The truth is, being underestimated has a strange advantage. It gives you uninterrupted access to reality. People don't perform as carefully around you. They don't filter as much. They assume your background. And background sees everything. I wasn't ambitious in the way they understood ambition. I didn't crave titles. I craved structural clarity, stability, integrity. What they saw was a quiet analyst. What I actually was someone who understood the entire system. And systems don't collapse because of noise. They collapse because of patterns. I knew that. They just didn't know I knew. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was a meeting invite. Subject line, data incident review, internal. No context, no summary, just a calendar block with 3 executives, legal, and me. When I walked into the conference room, the atmosphere felt curated. Not tense, not chaotic, just arranged. Chairs positioned evenly, notepads already placed. Bottled water aligned. That kind of neatness only happens when people have rehearsed. Ethan Caldwell, our chief operations officer, offered me a polite smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Layla, thanks for coming on short notice. I nodded and sat down, placing my laptop carefully in front of me. I noticed legal had printed something. That alone was unusual. We rarely printed internal materials unless we wanted them to feel formal. Ethan folded his hands. As you're aware, we've identified a leak of confidential pre-launch product data. I wasn't aware. I kept my expression neutral. He continued, the information appeared in a competitor's internal pitch deck last week. The overlap is specific. He paused, watching my face for a reaction. There's a particular kind of silence executives use. It's not empty. It's baited. I responded evenly. Has the access trail been isolated? A glance passed between him and legal. That's what we're reviewing, he said carefully. Preliminary logs show the data was accessed by your credentials within a relevant time window. There it was. Not an accusation, not directly, just positioning. My credentials. Not, you did this, but your access appears in the timeline. I felt something very small shift inside me. Not panic, not fear. Recognition, because I knew how access logs worked. I knew timestamps. I knew session authentication tokens. I knew how shared environments could blur surface-level tracking. And I also knew something else. No one had asked me for context before drawing this meeting together. That was the first small cut. They had formed a narrative before they invited me into it. I asked calmly, may I see the log extracts? Legal slid a stapled packet across the table. I flipped through it. Timestamps, access IDs, a filtered view, curated, not raw. Is this the full audit trail? I asked. It's what IT provided, Ethan replied. That answer told me more than the documents did. IT provided. Meaning someone had requested a filtered export. Meaning someone controlled what was being surfaced. The meeting ended without resolution, just phrases like, we're not making conclusions. We trust your professionalism. We just need clarity. But clarity wasn't what they were after. They were testing the reaction. In the hallway afterward, 2 colleagues who usually greeted me avoided eye contact. Not dramatically, just subtly. A half second too slow to acknowledge me. The story was already circulating, and here's what made it precise. No one confronted me openly. No one whispered loudly. No HR summons. No suspension. Just distance. I went back to my desk and opened the internal monitoring console. Not to defend myself yet, just to observe. Because the first small cut isn't the accusation. It's the realization that someone has quietly decided you're expendable enough for a position. Most people brush off moments like that. They assume the process will protect them, that logic will prevail. I didn't feel emotional. I felt alert. There's a difference. And in that moment, I understood something critical. If I reacted defensively, I would look unstable. If I ignored it, the narrative would harden. So I did something else. I said nothing, and I started watching more carefully than I ever had before. The accusation didn't escalate. It diffused, and somehow that made it worse. No formal charges, no suspension, no dramatic HR intervention. Just a quiet shift in tone across emails and meetings, as if a faint watermark had been stamped over my name. Subject lines became more formal. Requests that once came casually now included legal and CC. People started explaining things to me that I had built. That's how disrespect enters a room when it's trying to look professional. It wears courtesy like a mask. 2 days after the incident meeting, I joined a product sync call I'd attended every quarter for 3 years. Normally, I was the one who outlined compliance implications before launch milestones. This time, Ethan introduced the topic before I could speak. "We're reviewing data access protocols more tightly going forward," he said, tone neutral. "Just to ensure containment." Containment. The word landed carefully. No one looked at me, but everyone knew why it was being said. When I finally offered input, measured, technical, specific, there was a slight pause after I finished. Not disagreement, not correct, just hesitation, as if my expertise had developed a question mark overnight. I told myself it was temporary. Stress makes organizations cautious. Data leaks are serious. Of course, people would recalibrate. But recalibration turned into quiet sidelining. A week later, I noticed I was no longer included in an early-stage security planning thread. Not removed dramatically, just added later than usual, after foundational decisions had already been made. "Looping Layla in for compliance review," the email read. "For review, not for strategy." I stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. It would have been easy to respond sharply, to assert involvement, to remind them that compliance wasn't an afterthought, it was architecture. Instead, I wrote, "Thanks for including me. I'll assess and revert with notes." That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. I was beginning to rationalize it. They're under pressure. This is temporary. Once clarity comes, everything will normalize. But normalization can work in two directions. If you accept slight diminishment long enough, it stops feeling like diminishment. It becomes your new positioning. At lunch one afternoon, a colleague, Maya from Risk, sat across from me in the cafeteria. She stirred her coffee and said lightly, "It's probably just optics. You know how leadership is when something sensitive happens." Optics, another careful word. I asked, "Have you seen the full logs?" She hesitated half a second too long. "I'm not in that chain." But her eyes told me she'd heard more than she was saying. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about insulation. When something threatens the top, the system instinctively protects upward. And I, quiet, non-political, non-confrontational Layla, was structurally easier to absorb as collateral than someone with executive visibility. The disrespect wasn't loud. It was incremental. Meetings are scheduled without my input. Decisions were framed without my consultation. Conversations ended slightly earlier when I approached. And because none of it was overt, I couldn't call it out without sounding paranoid. That's how subtle reputational erosion works. It hides inside plausible deniability. I went home one evening and stood by my apartment window overlooking the Charles River, replaying the past week in my mind. Not emotionally, structurally. Who initiated the first meeting? Who requested the filtered logs? Who had the authority to curate that export? Patterns. Disrespect becomes dangerous when you accept it as procedural. I had spent my entire career ensuring systems followed traceable logic. Now I was inside a system where logic had been selectively applied. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had resisted. This might not be a misunderstanding. It might be a maneuver. I didn't feel angry. I felt clarity forming. And clarity, when it arrives quietly, changes how you stand in a room, even if no one else notices yet. There's a moment in every professional hierarchy when you realize the role people have silently written for you. It isn't in your job description. It's in how they look at you when something goes wrong. By the third week after the accusation, I understood my assigned part. I was the stabilizer, the absorber, the person whose credibility could be quietly dented without destabilizing the visible power structure. Not because I lacked value, but because my value operated backstage. At Whitmore Technologies, visibility was currency. Executives held it. Product leads accumulated it. Sales weaponized it. Compliance. We protected the stage from collapsing, but audiences don't applaud stage supports. In a follow-up meeting about the leak investigation, I noticed something subtle. The language had shifted again. "We need to ensure stronger accountability at all levels," Ethan said, looking generally toward the table. At all levels, not executive oversight, not architectural flaws, levels. It was a flattening phrase. It redistributed weight downward. Legal added, "This is not about blame. It's about restoring trust." Restoring trust implies it was broken. And in the room's unspoken script, I was the fracture point. I nodded occasionally, asked technical clarifying questions, and took notes. Not because I agreed, but because I was studying the choreography. Every organization has roles people are expected to play during a crisis. The vocal defender, the strategic visionary, the calm authority. Mine was simpler. Reliable, useful, invisible. The one who would accept increased scrutiny without protest. The one who would work longer hours to prove integrity. The one who would absorb implication quietly because professionalism demanded restraint. I recognized the expectation immediately, and for a brief moment I almost stepped into it. There's something seductive about being the good employee under pressure, the one who reassures leadership, the one who says, "Whatever you need, I'll cooperate fully." Because cooperation feels morally clean. But I paused. If I leaned too hard into compliance mode, if I overperformed innocence, it would reinforce the underlying premise that I needed to redeem myself. Redemption assumes guilt. I wasn't going to fight the narrative emotionally, but I wasn't going to validate it through performance either. So I adjusted, not outwardly, but internally. In meetings, I stopped volunteering early commentary. I waited. I listened longer than usual. When executives framed timelines, I let them finish before asking, "Would you like the full authentication chain or just the surface logs?" Specificity shifts power. It forces people to confront complexity. I began noticing discomfort in small ways. A tightening of posture, a brief glance between legal and IT when I mentioned raw audit trails. They weren't used to me positioning myself as an architectural authority. They were used to me being supportive infrastructure. That was the role. And roles are comfortable until someone refuses to inhabit them fully. At my desk, I reviewed my original employment contract, not defensively, just carefully. I checked policy documentation around breach investigations, procedural standards, chain of custody requirements for digital evidence. If this continued, I wanted to know exactly where I stood, not emotionally, but structurally. Because here's what I understood with absolute clarity. If they needed a quiet resolution, I was the easiest variable to adjust. But I was not the weakest point in the system. They just hadn't realized that yet. And the moment I stopped unconsciously playing the assigned role, the dynamic began to shift. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during an email exchange or a tense hallway moment. It happened on a Tuesday evening at 7:42 p.m. under fluorescent lights, when most of the executive floor had already gone home. I know the time because I looked at the clock when I felt it. I was alone in the compliance office, reviewing access authentication logs from the week the leak allegedly occurred. Not the filtered export legal had shown me. The raw logs, session IDs, multi-factor authentication timestamps, device fingerprints. When you stare at data long enough, it stops being numbers. It becomes behavior. And behavior leaves rhythm. I noticed something small, a login under my credentials at 11:17 p.m. on a Friday, an hour when I was not in the building. That alone wasn't impossible. Remote access existed. But the session originated from an internal IP range. Not residential, not VPN, internal. I leaned back slightly. That meant one of two things. Either someone had accessed the system from inside the building using my credentials, or the session token had been replicated within the network. Neither scenario pointed to carelessness on my part. It pointed to architecture. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel outraged. I felt still, because this was the first objective indication that the story forming around me was structurally unstable. I pulled additional logs, cross-referenced badge swipe data for that evening. My access card hadn't been used after 6:03 p.m. Yet my credentials showed activity 3 hours later. I opened the building network mapping file. The internal IP address traced back to a subnet reserved for executive offices, specifically floor 14, the executive floor. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, not in shock, in calibration. This was no longer about perception or tone or subtle distancing. This was about a traceable origin. And in that quiet office, under artificial lighting, something inside me shifted permanently. Until that night, part of me had still allowed for incompetence, for misunderstanding, for procedural error. But data doesn't misunderstand. It records. And this record was precise. I closed my laptop slowly and rested my hands on the desk. If I surfaced this immediately, burst into legal's office the next morning with printed evidence, it would look reactive, emotional, defensive. If I waited too long, the narrative against me could harden further. This wasn't a confrontation problem. It was a positioning problem. I walked to the window overlooking the darkened parking structure and considered the implications carefully. If the breach originated from the executive floor, then someone with authority or proximity to authority had either directly accessed the files or enabled someone who could. That meant the investigation wasn't neutral. It couldn't be, because the same level that had authority over the inquiry was potentially the source of the issue. The power geometry changed instantly in my mind, not because I suddenly held a weapon, but because I held context. And context, when undisclosed, is leverage. I drove home that night without music. No dramatic thoughts, no rehearsed speeches, just clarity. For weeks, I had been reacting to positioning. Now I understand the architecture beneath it. And I made a quiet decision. I would not confront. I would confirm before anyone else realized what I knew. That was the shift. Not anger, not revenge, precision. The next morning, I behaved exactly the same. That was deliberate. I arrived at 8:15 a.m., placed my bag under my desk, and greeted the receptionist with the same steady tone I always used. I attended the 9 a.m. compliance sync. I reviewed 2 vendor contracts. I responded to emails about regulatory documentation. No visible change. Inside, everything had recalibrated. Silence, up until that point, had been instinctual, a product of temperament. I wasn't confrontational by nature. I believed in process, in measured responses. But now silence became strategic. There's a difference between not speaking because you're unsure and not speaking because you're waiting. In the afternoon, Ethan stopped by my desk. "Any new insights on the access logs?" he asked casually. His tone was neutral, observational. I met his eyes evenly. "I'm reviewing additional authentication layers. The surface export wasn't comprehensive." A fractional pause. "Well," he said, offering a light smile, "let's make sure we keep this contained." Contained. The word again, but now I heard it differently. Contained meant controlled narrative. Contained meant minimizing fallout. Contained meant the breach itself mattered less than how far it traveled. I nodded. Of course. He walked away satisfied. And that's when I understood something critical. They believed I was still inside the role, still processing from the outside, still unaware of structural implications. They mistook my composure for ignorance. That was their miscalculation. Over the next several days, I asked IT for additional log access, under the guise of thoroughness. No resistance. They trusted my diligence. I expanded my scope quietly, cross-checked session tokens against device IDs, compared badge access logs with server room camera timestamps. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Silence can feel passive from the outside, but internally it sharpens everything. I became hyper-aware of hallway conversations. Those who avoided the compliance wing. Of those who suddenly scheduled closed-door meetings on floor 14 during odd hours. None of it was dramatic. It was pattern accumulation. At one point, Maya from Risk leaned against my desk and said, "You're handling this really well." "Handling what?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "The scrutiny." I smiled slightly. "Scrutiny is just data with emotion attached." She laughed, unsure whether I was joking. I wasn't. What they interpreted as resilience was calculation. I wasn't trying to clear my name emotionally. I was mapping power. And here's something people underestimate about quiet women in technical roles. We don't need volume to feel certainty. By the end of that week, I had confirmed 3 things. The login under my credentials originated from a static executive floor IP block. The session device fingerprint did not match my company-issued laptop. The raw logs had been filtered before being presented in the initial meeting. Filtered by someone with administrative authority, that narrowed the field significantly. But I didn't confront anyone, because silence, when intentional, unsettles people more than defense. They expected one of 2 reactions from me: overcorrection or visible stress. Instead, they got steadiness, and steadiness makes those who are hiding something uneasy. I began noticing slight tension when I entered certain rooms, conversations tapering off mid-sentence. Executive assistants glance at screens quickly before minimizing windows. They sensed something had shifted, even if they couldn't name it. That's the power of chosen silence. It removes predictability, and when you remove predictability from a power structure built on assumption, you introduce doubt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't escalate. I just kept collecting and waiting. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. While the company recalibrated around the idea that I was under review, I recalibrated around something else entirely: verification. They never noticed the shift because I didn't give them anything visible to notice. I began arriving slightly earlier, not conspicuously early, just enough to access server logs before most departments were active. Early morning network traffic is quieter. Patterns stand out more clearly. I requested a standard quarterly audit of privileged account permissions. That wasn't unusual. It fell within compliance protocol. But this time, I ran deeper correlation checks, mapping credential usage against physical device MAC addresses. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal, just thorough. What I found confirmed my earlier suspicion. The login under my credentials had been authenticated through a secondary administrative bridge account, one used exclusively by IT leadership and executive support staff. Bridge accounts are designed for maintenance, not discretion, which meant someone had either misused elevated access or believed they were insulated enough that no one would check beneath the surface layer. They were counting on surface review. I don't operate on surface review. At the same time, I began documenting everything, not just data, but process irregularities. dates when filtered logs were generated, email timestamps requesting specific exports. Who initiated each inquiry? I kept the documentation off company servers, not out of paranoia, out of prudence. I stored copies in encrypted personal archives, timestamped and hash verified. Not to weaponize, to preserve integrity. There's a difference. In parallel, I scheduled a casual coffee with one of the senior IT architects, Daniel. We'd worked together for years. He respected technical competence more than hierarchy. I'm reviewing the authentication chain from the leak window, I said lightly. Something doesn't align. He frowned slightly. IT provided legal with the relevant logs. Yes, I replied evenly, but I'm tracing bridge account activity tied to credential mirroring. His eyes sharpened. That would require executive-level override, he said carefully. Exactly. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Daniel wasn't political. He was technical. And technical minds understand anomalies without emotional framing. After that conversation, I noticed subtle tightening on floor 14. A sudden push for streamlined reporting. A request that future compliance reviews route through executive channels first. Control reasserting itself. But they still believed I was reacting to scrutiny. They didn't realize I had already moved beyond defense. What they never noticed was how carefully I was positioning. I reviewed the company's whistleblower policy. I consulted quietly with an external employment attorney, not to file anything, just to understand boundaries. I ensured my personal performance reviews were archived in full, including language affirming exemplary integrity. Preparation is often mistaken for paranoia, but in environments where narrative can override truth, preparation is survival. One evening, I sat alone in the compliance office again, staring at the compiled evidence on my screen. IP trace, executive floor, subnet 14.3, 2.8, 8.0. Bridge account I, D admin dash, support dash E14. Session token. Replication time, 23/17/42. Filtered log. Export request. Initiated, 8:12 a.m. Next business day by Executive Ops. The chain was clean, no speculation, no emotion, just alignment, and in that alignment, I felt something steady settle into place. They had underestimated not my intelligence, but my patience. Because here's what people often miss about quiet professionals. We don't rush to win arguments. We wait to eliminate doubt. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt certain. Certainty doesn't shout, it prepares. By the end of that week, I had a complete timeline, independently verified, technically sound, and legally defensible. And still, I said nothing, because the moment you reveal leverage determines who retains control. And I wasn't interested in confrontation. I was interested in precision. They thought I was under review. In reality, I was building the review. I didn't announce what I found. I didn't even print it. The reveal at first was only to myself. On a Thursday evening, after most of the building had emptied, I opened the final compiled report on my screen. Not a company-formatted document. A clean, chronological reconstruction built from raw logs, badge access data, and bridge account authentication records. No commentary, no adjectives, just facts aligned in sequence. 2314, Executive Floor Badge Access, Office 14C, 2317, Bridge Account Authentication Initiated, 231742, Credential Mirroring Event logged under my user ID, 2319, Access to Pre-Launch Product Repository, 2326, Data Export Initiated, 812, Next Business Day, Filtered Log Request sent to IT 903, Curated Export delivered to Legal. When viewed separately, each entry looked procedural, innocuous. When viewed together, they told a single story. The source traced back to the executive floor, specifically to a private office used by Ethan Caldwell's executive operations team. I stared at the timeline for a long time, not because I was shocked, but because I understood the weight of what it meant. This wasn't an IT error. It wasn't a junior employee misusing credentials. It was either direct involvement or willful blindness at the highest operational level. And suddenly, everything from the past few weeks recontextualized. The carefully curated meeting, the filtered logs, the emphasis on containment, the subtle distancing. They weren't investigating a leak. They were managing exposure, and I had been selected as the manageable variable. That realization could have made me angry. Instead, it made me quiet. There's a moment when truth stops being emotional and becomes structural. When you realize the issue isn't personal, it's systemic self-preservation. I closed my eyes briefly and asked myself a simple question. What outcome do I actually want? Not vindication, not an apology, not a public spectacle. I wanted alignment. I wanted the narrative corrected without theatrics. But I also understood something essential. Once revealed, this information couldn't be contained again. It would ripple. Executive-level breach tied to internal data misattribution, that doesn't disappear quietly. So I evaluated my options. Option 1, present the evidence internally and trust the same structure that attempted to filter it. Unlikely to yield fairness. Option 2, escalate externally, regulatory reporting, formal whistleblower action, high impact, irreversible. Option 3, create a scenario where the truth surfaces through formal audit channels without framing it as personal defense. That option required patience. And patience I had. Before making any move, I needed confirmation beyond a reasonable doubt. So I ran one final verification. Device fingerprint comparison against known executive-issued hardware. The MAC address tied to the bridge authentication matched a device registered to executive operations. Not Ethan personally, but his floor, his oversight. That was enough. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. Because once you know the architecture of truth, ignoring it makes you complicit. I shut down my computer, placed my silver USB drive back around my neck, and turned off the office lights. Walking through the empty hallway, I passed the elevator that led to floor 14. I didn't press the button. Not yet. Reveals are most effective when they don't look like reveals. And what I was preparing wasn't an accusation. It was a correction. A quiet, irreversible correction. They still believed the situation was contained. They believed I was stabilizing under scrutiny. They had no idea that the structural map of their own narrative now lived fully formed in my hands. No celebration, no adrenaline, no dramatic satisfaction. Just clarity. And clarity, when private, is the most controlled form of leverage. I stepped out into the cold Boston air that night and realized something subtle but undeniable. The balance had shifted. They just didn't know it yet. Clarity is powerful, but clarity alone doesn't change anything. Action does. The weekend after I confirmed the executive floor trace, I didn't open my laptop. I didn't rerun logs. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I went for long walks along the river and let the question settle naturally. What kind of ending do I want? Because there were endings available to me. I could walk into Ethan's office, close the door, and place the timeline on his desk. Watch his expression shift, force acknowledgement. But that would make it personal. He could frame it as a misunderstanding, a systems glitch, a security anomaly under review. And if the conversation remained private, the narrative could still be rewritten. I could file a formal whistleblower report with external regulators. The evidence met the threshold. The documentation was clean. But that would trigger a public investigation. Shareholder exposure, media risk, collateral damage to hundreds of employees who had nothing to do with the breach. That wasn't justice. That was detonation. There was a third option, quieter, slower, but structurally stronger. Whitmore Technologies was due for its annual third-party cybersecurity audit in 6 weeks. A comprehensive, independent review of internal controls and authentication protocols. Normally, compliance prepared surface documentation for those audits, clean summaries, controlled access. But this year, I could ensure something different. I could submit the raw authentication chain as part of the required transparency packet. Not as an accusation. As data, auditors don't respond to emotion. They respond to discrepancies. If I embedded the full trace within standard reporting, the question would surface from outside the executive hierarchy, not from me. It would no longer be Layla defending herself. It would be an independent inquiry asking why credential mirroring occurred on floor 14. That option had consequences. Once auditors flagged it, internal legal review would follow. Executive oversight would be scrutinized. Board members would be informed. And there would be no clean way to minimize it. I sat at my kitchen table Saturday night, a glass of water untouched beside me, and weighed the final piece. Was I prepared for fallout? Because once I chose this path, the company might survive, but relationships would not. Trust, even strained, would fracture permanently. My career at Whitmore might become untenable, not because I did anything wrong, but because power rarely forgives exposure. I thought about the past few weeks, the subtle distancing, the curated logs, the attempt to position me as the quiet resolution. If I did nothing, the narrative would calcify. I would remain the incident, even if unproven. If I confronted privately, the truth could be negotiated. If I embedded it in an audit, the truth would become structural. That was the irreversible option. And irreversible felt honest, not dramatic, not vengeful, just aligned. On Sunday evening, I opened my laptop and reviewed the compliance submission template for the upcoming audit. Section 4, Authentication Protocol Review. Required, raw log samples tied to any anomalous credential usage within the past fiscal year. It was standard language. No one had paid special attention to it before. This time I would. I didn't feel triumphant when I made the decision. I felt calm, because I wasn't choosing destruction. I was choosing. And process, when allowed to function without interference, corrects what politics tries to distort. The moment I saved the updated audit preparation outline, something inside me settled completely. There would be no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic reveal, just a simple, undeniable trace. The source traced back to the executive floor. And soon it wouldn't be me saying it. It would be the system. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. That was the beauty of it. No sudden shifts in behavior, no coded emails, no secret meetings in parking garages, just compliance work, done thoroughly. Audit preparation season always brought a controlled kind of chaos. Departments scrambled to sanitize documentation. IT compiled surface-level logs, legal pre-reviewed summaries to anticipate external questions. This time, I volunteered to oversee the authentication protocol section personally. Given the recent incident, I said in the planning meeting, tone measured, "It's best if we present a fully transparent trail." No one objected. Transparency is a word executives rarely argue with in public settings. They still believed I was working to stabilize the situation. In reality, I was widening the lens. I compiled the audit packet meticulously. First, a summary of credential access procedures. Second, an outline of multi-factor authentication layers. Third, a notation of a credential mirroring event detected within the review period. Neutral phrasing. Credential mirroring event detected, not breach, not misuse. Then I attached the raw log extracts, unfiltered. Timestamp, IP origin, bridge account ID, device fingerprint, badge access correlation. Clean, undeniable, contextualized. I made sure the formatting followed our standard compliance template, so it wouldn't draw suspicion before review. Then I routed the draft to legal for standard pre-audit check. This was the only moment I anticipated resistance. Instead, something else happened. Legal skimmed. They focused on regulatory citations, on encryption standards, on policy language. They did not drill into the log appendix, because to them it was technical, and technical details were Layla's domain. That was the miscalculation. The very invisibility that had positioned me as expendable now shielded the depth of what I was submitting. A week later, the third-party auditors arrived, calm, detached, methodical. They requested authentication anomaly clarification on day 2. Not dramatically, just a bullet point in a scheduled session. "Can you walk us through the credential mirroring event flagged in Section 4? The lead auditor asked. The room went quiet. Ethan's posture shifted subtly beside me. I opened my laptop and projected the timeline. "Certainly," I said evenly. "The event originated from internal IP subnet 14.3.2.88.0. Cross-reference with badge access indicates presence on executive floor, Office 14C. No inflection, just sequence." The auditor adjusted his glasses. "And the mirrored credentials belong to?" "My account," I replied calmly, without a corresponding device match. Silence. Not explosive, not chaotic, just heavy. The auditor nodded slowly. "Has this been internally remediated?" I answered truthfully. The anomaly was initially filtered in preliminary exports. Full review is pending deeper trace correlation. I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't need to. The auditor requested expanded bridge account access logs. They were provided. Once external review enters the architecture, internal containment dissolves. That's how systems work. By the end of the week, the tone on floor 14 had changed. Not toward me, toward each other. Closed-door meetings extended longer than usual. Executive assistants moved quickly between offices. Legal scheduled unscripted consultations. No one confronted me. No one accused me again. They were too busy recalculating exposure, and I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, calm, measured, available for clarification. From the outside, it looked like I had simply done my job, and that was true. I had. But this time, I had done it without absorbing someone else's narrative. I didn't celebrate. I didn't confide in colleagues. I went home each evening quietly, aware that something irreversible was unfolding. Not because I had pushed it, but because I had stopped protecting what wasn't mine to protect. The system was now examining itself, and this time I wasn't the variable under review. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They surface in absences. The first sign wasn't a meeting. It was a cancellation. The weekly executive operations sync, usually rigidly protected, was suddenly postponed pending internal alignment. Pending alignment. Language softens when pressure rises. By Monday morning, the building felt different. Not chaotic, not panicked, just recalibrating. People on floor 14 moved more quietly. Assistants who once maintained casual hallway warmth now wore neutral expressions. Legal doors remained closed longer than usual. No one said anything to me directly, but something had shifted in the gravitational field. The auditors extended their stay by 2 additional days. That extension alone signaled impact. In large companies, time equals cost. And auditors don't stay longer unless they're tracing threads. I was asked to provide additional authentication records. Again, procedural. I complied without commentary. Ethan, on the other hand, looked different. Not disheveled, not outwardly distressed, but precise. Overly precise. His emails became shorter. His language is more legalistic. Meetings are more controlled. When he did speak to me, it was measured to the point of sterility. "Thank you for the thorough documentation," he said once, not quite meeting my eyes. There was no accusation left in his tone, only distance. And distance, this time, wasn't directed at me. Midweek, an internal memo circulated from the board's audit committee announcing a temporary review of executive-level access controls. Temporary. Review. Executive level. The phrasing was careful but unmistakable. I read the memo once, then closed it. Not with satisfaction, with acknowledgement. The narrative had inverted. Weeks earlier, I had been the quiet variable under suspicion. Now the scrutiny had moved upward. Colleagues who once avoided eye contact began re-engaging. Casual greetings returned. Invitations to strategy threads reappeared in my inbox. No apologies, just restoration. But restoration without acknowledgement feels hollow. Maya from Risk stopped by my desk again. "I heard the auditors dug deeper than expected," she said carefully. I looked at her calmly. "That's what audits are designed to do." She studied me for a moment, then asked softly, "Were you worried?" I considered the question. "No," I said truthfully. I was prepared. That answer seemed to unsettle her more than fear would have, because preparation implies foresight, and foresight implies awareness. By Friday, the executive floor felt insulated, not from me, but from itself. Meetings were held with fewer participants. Security badges were temporarily reissued. IT implemented stricter authentication controls. Publicly, it was framed as a proactive enhancement. Privately, everyone understood. No one mentioned my name anymore in connection with the leak. The absence of that association was louder than any apology could have been. Still, I didn't feel victorious. Consequences are not celebrations, they're corrections. And corrections often cost more than people anticipate. I knew what was coming next. Not chaos, not scandal. Restructuring. Organizations rarely implode. They adjust, and adjustments at the top rippled downward. I continued my work as if nothing had changed, because on the surface, nothing had. But beneath it, power was rebalancing. And once power begins recalibrating under external observation, it doesn't snap back easily. The consequences had begun, not loudly, not publicly, but structurally. And structural shifts don't reverse themselves just because someone wishes they would. The formal announcement came 2 weeks later. Short, controlled, framed as a strategic evolution. Effective immediately, executive operations will undergo restructuring to enhance accountability and reinforce internal controls. Ethan Caldwell was placed on temporary administrative leave pending review, not terminated, not accused, just removed from active oversight. The language was clinical, but the impact was unmistakable. The day the memo circulated, floor 14 felt hollow. Assistants moved quietly, packing files into labeled boxes. IT technicians replaced hardware in executive offices under the guise of system upgrades. No one made eye contact with me in the elevator that morning, not out of suspicion, out of awareness, because at this point, everyone understood where the trace had led. The source traced back to the executive floor. That sentence never appeared in any memo, but it lived in the building like oxygen. Midweek, legal requested a one-on-one meeting with me, not hostile, not accusatory, careful. The general counsel sat across from me, hands folded. "We appreciate the thoroughness of your audit preparation," she began. "It ensured transparency." Transparency, I nodded. "There were gaps in oversight at the executive operations level," she continued. "Your documentation clarified that." Clarified, not exposed, not revealed, clarified. "We regret," she added after a pause, "that earlier internal reviews may have created discomfort." Discomfort, I almost smiled at the understatement. But I didn't. "I trust the audit process," I replied calmly. That was enough. She studied me for a moment longer, perhaps expecting more. A request, a complaint, a negotiation. I offered none, because by that point, there was nothing left to fix. The structure had already corrected itself, and correction, once externalized, cannot be quietly undone. Ethan's leave became a permanent resignation within a month, officially for leadership misalignment. Unofficially, the bridge account logs were too precise to reinterpret. There was no scandal, no media. The board handled it internally. Contained, but not in the way originally intended. What struck me most wasn't the removal itself. It was the shift in tone across the company afterward. Compliance was invited earlier into strategic planning. Audit sections were expanded. Bridge account access protocols were tightened with multi-party oversight. I was asked, publicly this time, to lead a cross-department authentication integrity initiative. The same rooms that had once watched me cautiously now looked to me for architectural direction. And yet, there was no apology from Ethan, no private acknowledgement, just absence. At one point, I passed his former office, empty now, blinds half drawn. Power leaves quietly when it knows it cannot defend itself. Some colleagues expected me to feel vindicated. They misread the situation. Vindication implies emotional triumph. What I felt was something else. Finality. Because here's the truth about moments like this. By the time leadership realizes the narrative is collapsing, it's already too late. Not because someone shouted, not because someone fought, but because someone documented. And documentation doesn't negotiate. The weeks of subtle distancing, the curated logs, the quiet implication of my guilt, they had been strategic. But so had my silence. When systems try to preserve themselves at the expense of integrity, they often miscalculate one thing. The quiet ones understand the architecture better than anyone. By the time the consequences surfaced publicly, there was no scrambling left to do. No defensive statements, no rewriting. It was simply over, and there was nothing anyone could say to reverse it. I didn't expect to see him again, but 2 weeks after his resignation became official, I received a short email from Ethan's personal account. Subject: brief conversation, no explanation, just a proposed time and a neutral downtown location. Quiet, discreet. I considered declining. There was nothing left to clarify. But I also understood something about unfinished architecture. Sometimes it's cleaner to close the loop calmly. So I agreed. We met on a Wednesday afternoon at a hotel lounge overlooking the harbor. Public enough to remain professional, private enough to speak without an audience. He looked composed, not diminished, just recalibrated. "Layla," he said as I sat down, "thank you for coming." I nodded. We ordered coffee, no small talk. After a moment, he leaned forward slightly. "You handled the audit submission carefully," he said. Not accusatory, not appreciative. Observational. "I followed protocol," I replied. A faint exhale left him. "You could have escalated more aggressively." I didn't need to. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just measured. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "The bridge account shouldn't have been used that way," he said finally. Executive operations believed they were stress testing access vulnerabilities. Stress testing. I held his gaze. "By mirroring my credentials without authorization?" I asked calmly. Another pause. "The intention wasn't to implicate you," he said. "Intent and outcome are rarely aligned in power structures." "The filtered logs were authorized before I reviewed the full trace," he added carefully. "The optics were mismanaged." Optics. Containment. Discomfort. The language had stayed consistent to the end. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. "I understand how containment can override clarity," I said evenly. He studied me, perhaps expecting frustration or moral condemnation. I offered neither. "Why didn't you come to me privately?" he asked. There it was, the real question. "Because if I had come privately, the narrative could have been negotiated," I answered simply. "Because the audit process was already scheduled." He sat back, absorbing that. "You let the system handle it?" "Yes." Another quiet stretch. "I underestimated you," he said at last. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't apologetic. It was factual. "I was never trying to be underestimated," I replied. "I was trying to be accurate." Something shifted in his expression. Not regret exactly, but recognition. After a few more minutes of restrained conversation, he stood. "I suppose this is closure," he said. "For the incident," I answered. "Yes." He extended his hand. I shook it, not as victor and defeated, not as accuser and accused, just as two professionals who had reached the end of a structural correction. As I walked out into the harbor light, I felt no adrenaline, no satisfaction, just steadiness, because confrontation without heat is powerful. It leaves no residue. And in that moment, I realized something essential. I hadn't defeated him. I had simply refused to carry what wasn't mine. If you walked into Whitmore Technologies today, you wouldn't see a dramatic transformation. There are no plaques on the wall with my name on them. No symbolic promotions framed as redemption. On paper, my title shifted slightly. Director of Authentication and Data Integrity. A natural evolution, they called it. But what changed wasn't the title. It was the positioning. I'm no longer looped in for compliance review. I'm present at the beginning of structural conversations. When new systems are proposed, I'm asked, Layla, how would this hold up under audit? When access protocols are adjusted, I'm consulted before implementation. Not because I demanded it, because the architecture proved it necessary. The interesting part is this: I don't feel more powerful. I feel more aligned. The weeks of quiet suspicion taught me something permanent. Reputation is fragile when it's built on perception alone. But when it's reinforced by documented integrity, it stabilizes differently. I don't speak louder in meetings now. I don't dominate rooms. I still sit halfway down the table. But when I do speak, there's no hesitation afterward. No pause, just acknowledgement. The subtle question mark that once hovered around my expertise is gone, and I didn't remove it with emotion. I removed it with structure. Occasionally, newer employees ask me about the audit year. The story circulates in fragments, never with full detail. I keep it that way, not to protect anyone, but because the point was never a scandal. The point was correct. I think about those early meetings sometimes, the curated logs, the careful phrasing, the gentle implication. If I had reacted defensively, I would have reinforced their positioning. If I had confronted privately, I might have secured a quiet resolution, but not structural change. What defined me in that season wasn't intelligence. It was a restraint. Restraint allowed the system to reveal itself, and that revelation redefined how I see myself. I used to think being underestimated was a flaw I had to overcome. Now I understand it as leverage. When people assume you're safe, you gain unobstructed visibility. And visibility, when paired with integrity, is formidable. I don't harbor resentment toward Ethan. Power structures behave predictably under threat. What matters is whether you allow yourself to be reshaped by them. I didn't. I stayed precise. And in doing so, I realized something that extends beyond offices and audits. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your position. You don't have to humiliate anyone to restore balance. You don't even have to announce the truth. Sometimes you simply present it and let the structure adjust. Today, when I wear the silver USB necklace that my mother once teased me about, it feels different. Not symbolic of defense, symbolic of memory. A reminder that documentation is quiet power, that patience can outlast narrative, that integrity doesn't need performance, and that who I am was never defined by the accusation. It was defined by how I chose to respond. When I look back on that season now, I don't remember it as the year I was accused. I remember it as the year I stopped confusing silence with surrender. I was accused of leaking confidential data until I revealed the IP address. That sentence sounds dramatic, almost cinematic, but living through it didn't feel dramatic. It felt slow. It felt procedural. It felt like sitting in rooms where people carefully adjusted language around you and decided not to flinch. The truth didn't explode into the open. It traced back quietly. The source traced back to the executive floor. And when it did, I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to defend myself publicly. I didn't need revenge. I needed alignment. What I learned is this: when you are underestimated, you have two choices. You can try to prove your worth loudly, or you can understand the system so well that it eventually proves you right. Integrity isn't dramatic, documentation isn't emotional, and patience isn't weakness. They're structural advantages. There will always be environments where power protects itself first, where narratives form before facts are reviewed, where the quietest person in the room becomes the easiest variable to adjust. But here's what I know now. If you know your architecture, your values, your competence, your truth, you don't need to panic when suspicion circles you. You prepare, you verify, you move with precision, and when the moment comes, you let evidence speak in a voice no one can interrupt. I didn't win, I didn't conquer, I corrected. And correction, when done calmly, reshapes more than confrontation ever could. So if you've ever found yourself sitting in a room where people quietly question you, if you felt the subtle shift of distance without explanation, if you've been underestimated because you refuse to perform strength loudly, I want to ask you something. When your moment of clarity comes, will you react or will you respond with structure? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the quietest stories carry the strongest lessons, and sometimes the most powerful move is simply showing the evidence.